Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion in philosophy of food of liberty, liberalism, and the harm principle. This comes from chapter 7 of the textbook by Placius, chapter 7 again on food, health, and freedom. I'm going to give you a general kind of summary of the main issues that Placius is going through in this chapter. I've also included a couple other videos that deal more specifically with Mill's harm principle as well as paternalism. Both of these play a really crucial role in the material for this week, this module. But let's begin today by looking at how food, freedom, and health actually intersect in a lot of important ways and how, philosophically speaking, these ideas about liberty and paternalism are crucial insofar as they help us think critically about different food policies. So let's start with liberalism. What does this term mean? Liberalism is generally speaking, it's a political philosophy centered on the different values that we associate with individual liberties, right? And insofar as liberalism puts a huge amount of value and significance on individual liberty itself, that we can think about this in terms of maximizing autonomy. Certainly in both deontological as well as utilitarian ethics, autonomy plays a crucial role. For Kant and deontology, autonomy is crucial because we need to respect the autonomous choice of rational agents. Rational autonomy is central to Kant's view. But autonomy is also very important for utilitarianism, because utilitarianism wants to maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And one really important way of doing that is by maximizing autonomy, giving people the choices that they need to make decisions for themselves that would bring happiness and reduce suffering. So, in that regard, then, one of the most influential defenders of liberalism as a kind of political philosophy is John Stuart Mill, who, of course, argued that personal freedoms should never be limited unless it's going to prevent harm to somebody else. Right. So, insofar as we want people to be able to make choices for themselves, that's a good thing, unless it turns out that their choices could be harmful to someone. Take, for instance, smoking. I am unfortunately a smoker. I shouldn't be. I know I need to quit, and so on and so forth. But I would never like smoke a cigarette in the car when my daughter is in the car with me, or I wouldn't smoke a cigarette in a public restaurant. Why? Well, because my free choice, my autonomous choice to smoke could harm somebody else. But if I'm all by myself, I'm driving in the middle of nowhere, maybe I'm on the highway in the middle of Texas, there's not a single person around me, well, then maybe I might smoke a cigarette in my car because I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not harming anybody by doing so. So this is the basis of what's called Mill's harm principle, where the idea is that we each are the best judges of our own good, what's going to be good for ourselves, and that society should not really interfere with our choices simply because others think that we're making some sort of a mistake. And so it's a principle that's related to paternalism, which again you should have already watched the different videos that I provided for you, both on Mill's harm principle and paternalism. I cash out those principles in much more detail, which are crucial for this material here. But here's one way that John Stuart Mill puts it in his book on liberty. Mill says, quote, "The only purpose which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." That's another way of saying the only justification for paternalism is if your choice, your autonomous choice, might bring harm to somebody else. So according to this principle, the harm principle, if I choose to eat an entire cake, let's say, right? Let's say for whatever reason I've got the munchies and I've got a sweet tooth, and so I want to eat an entire cake for dinner. Well, that might be in some sense foolish, it may not be very healthy, but unless I'm actually harming somebody else, then the state should not step in and say, you can't do this. The state should not minimize or put up a roadblock in my ability to express my autonomy in that regard. However, when it comes to things like food and health, things get quite complicated. And that's because poor diets contribute to healthcare costs. And insofar as poor diets, like if you're going to eat cake every single night, insofar as that contributes to the rising of healthcare costs, that suggests to us that we need to think about things in terms of shared collectivity through insurances or taxes is probably a better way to put it, so that my unhealthy eating is not purely a private matter, right? It's a public matter. Or we might think about it in terms of whether or not my unhealthy eating actually is going to harm other people, either directly or indirectly. And so that's where this tension arises. That's the tension at the heart of this chapter, it seems like. Where does one's personal freedom end and one's social responsibility begin? So let's think about things first in terms of deontological ethics or a kind of a rights-based approach to defending this view of liberalism. So both deontology and taking a kind of a rights-based perspective to normative ethics in general, freedom isn't merely valuable because it gives us the right sorts of consequences. Instead, we should think about the value of freedom being contingent on the fact that it respects one's dignity as a rational agent. Remember, deontology rejects the notion that morality should be understood in terms of its consequences, right? It's a form of non-consequentialist normative theory. So what's much more important for deontology is treating different rational agents as the sorts of creatures that can make decisions for themselves, autonomous choices for themselves. And so when we hinder that, when we take it away, then we're doing something wrong. We're treating somebody as a mere means to an end rather than an end in themselves. So, on this view, people have a moral right to autonomy insofar as they have a right to make choices for themselves, even bad choices, right? The state's role is to protect that right, not to ensure good outcomes, right? So, the government should be protecting your ability to make choices for yourself in irrespective of what the consequences might happen to be. So even if the government knows that trans fats, for instance, or that sugar and sugary sodas or whatever are very harmful, maybe even smoking, we know this stuff is harmful. That's not a dispute. But the deontologist is going to worry that banning these things are going to be disrespectful to a person's autonomous choice, to a person's agency, the ability to make a decision for themselves. It treats adults like children in some regard, which implies that they can't make their own decisions. And the rights-based approach to liberalism also is going to say something very similar here, right? It values respect over results. And it's much better, according to this kind of approach, that we should let people make errors freely rather than to force people to make the correct choice. Now, what about consequentialism? What would consequentialists say about liberalism? According to consequentialism or utilitarianism, more specifically, they might defend liberty by showing that it's really freedom itself that produces the best overall outcomes. Right? So if you want to maximize good consequences, if you want to maximize happiness and reduce suffering, one of the best ways to do that is freedom. Freedom is the best way to produce the best outcomes. So when people are free to choose, they can experiment on things, they can innovate, they can take responsibility for their own lives if they choose to. But as a society that respects this sort of liberty, these sort of societies tend to be more dynamic and creative and adaptable, and that's good for society. So, in the context of food, this means that consumers should be what is driving the innovation. Consumers should be the one that's sort of driving the demand for healthy products, and people are going to be able to learn and experience from their mistakes and then adjust their different bad habits. Right? Take for instance the fact that I know that smoking is bad, and I've been trying to quit for a long time. I know one day I will quit smoking. So I should be able to learn from these experiences and then make a choice for myself. That encourages, that kind of freedom embraces diversity of diets, diversity of cultural expression, diversity of one's own choices, right? So a consequentialist might try to show that liberalism is actually the right way to go, but yet still at the same point support that some food regulations are good. But only those regulations that would maximize well-being in the long run, not because freedom itself is sacred. Freedom itself is not the end-all be-all, but instead, freedom is what maximizes happiness. But if your free choice hinders somebody else's happiness, if it actually produces more suffering than good, then it seems we would have the ability and the moral clarity to regulate different foods and different diets and so forth. So we can already see a clear contrast developing here. Deontological approaches to liberalism would protect liberty as a right, even if it turns out that it leads to bad outcomes. Whereas consequentialism and utilitarianism, these approaches to liberalism in general would protect liberty because it usually produces the best outcomes, even though in some cases it may not. Now, with regard to our conception of liberty itself, philosophers oftentimes distinguish between what we might call negative liberty or also positive liberty. So, what do we mean by this? Negative liberty means the freedom from interference, right? No one can physically or legally prevent me from eating whatever the hell I want. If I want that cake for dinner, then I should be able to have it. Nobody can stop me. Right? That's the kind of negative liberty or negative rights we might think about here. But there's also positive liberty or positive rights, which means that we should have the right to act as I truly want to, however I want to, or the ability to self-govern, to make choices, rational choices for myself. And this distinction becomes important when we think about how food environments shape one's behavior. So, for instance, someone living in a food desert, where what we mean by this is there is no good place to buy healthy food for maybe miles and miles and miles. Somebody in that situation might be negatively free insofar as they can eat healthy, and that just means that no law is going to prevent them from doing so. But they may not be positively free, since fresh, affordable produce is not available in that situation. So even if we say that we are free to make a healthy choice, that freedom may not be what we want it to be. It may be, in some sense, hollow if the surrounding conditions make those choices nearly impossible. Right. So this leads to a very important insight that we get from the chapter, which is that freedom requires much more than just the absence of coercion. It also requires access to resources and the right sorts of education and so forth. So that introduces another issue that's relevant here, which is the relationship between food freedom and failure of will. Again, I'm a smoker and I've been trying to quit smoking for a long time. And so this is going to be my clear example of weakness of my will or failure of will. Now let's shift to that specifically, right? There are going to be external obstacles to internal desires and internal intentions. We all know what it's like to have some good intentions. I've got my good intentions to quit smoking, yet I still at the same time fail to follow through with that. I might make a plan to quit smoking, and then all of a sudden it's been a stressful day, and I decide to smoke a cigarette before I go to bed. Or as it relates to food, you might have a plan to go on a better diet, to eat more greens and eat less sugary foods. Maybe you're going to have a salad for dinner. Nonetheless, you end up eating a bunch of fries. Philosophers call this problem acrasia, which basically just it's a way of talking about the weakness of will. Here, what we mean is that in these sorts of moments, the conflict isn't between me and society, but rather there's a conflict between different reasons I have and the different desires I have. I desire to quit smoking, but I also have a desire to enjoy a cigarette. A desire to go on a diet and eat more salads, but I also really like those fries. That's another desire I have. So it's this conflict between different desires and different reasons that we might have. According to a philosopher like David Hume, Hume might say that my passions win out over my reason in these sorts of situations, where another philosopher like Aristotle might say that I fail to live according to my own rational judgment of what the good is. So here's a question I want you to think about. If it's the case that our own psychology actually prevents us from acting freely in these sorts of situations, could external support like governmental laws or governmental regulations, could these sort of things actually increase our freedom by helping us to do what it is that we really want to do in the first place? Or should we better understand those things as pure paternalism, where the government is stepping in and saying, we know what's right for you, so we're gonna force you to make these decisions. And again, that's a crucial aspect of these issues that's related to paternalism. So you should definitely watch the video where I talk about what paternalism is in more detail. But as it relates to this particular chapter, we can straightforwardly sketch out what paternalism means when we say it refers to restricting one's liberty for their own good. Right? The government makes a decision on behalf of the individual because it looks like the government knows what's best for the individual. Much like a parent limits a child's choice because the child doesn't really know what's good for them, whereas the parent does. Classic examples here would be like seatbelt laws, bans on different kinds of dangerous drugs, or maybe even things like mandatory vaccinations. But in the context of food, paternalism could justify things like soda taxes to discourage excessive sugar consumption, or trans fat bans to remove harmful ingredients, or maybe calorie labeling to promote informed decisions. Here, the idea is that we want to argue for policies that are going to protect one's health and reduce one's suffering. And of course, critics are going to respond by claiming that this violates one's autonomy, and without good justification, that's not appropriate. These sort of critics might argue that it assumes that the government actually really does know what's best for the individual, and that the individual is not in the best position to make a decision for themselves, that they don't really know what's best for themselves. And so that creates a very interesting puzzle. When, if ever, is it justified to limit one's ability to make a decision for themselves, or to limit one's rational autonomy, or their freedom and liberty to make these sorts of decisions? And also their ability to make poor, bad decisions, right? We don't want to just force people to make good decisions. A part of learning and growing as an individual is learning from your mistakes. So we do want to allow people to make mistakes. Of course, there may be other issues that are at work here with regard to the weakness of will and acrasia. As we've seen previously, there may be things like cognitive biases that are shaping our approach to how we're thinking about different issues related to these topics. For instance, in modern psychology, this certainly complicates the debate. If we're going to try to show that humans are not purely rational agents, that is. So our decisions really are shaped by the different cognitive biases and different heuristics or contextual clues that might be, influencing our decisions. For instance, there might be something like the status quo bias, where we might prefer existing habits, or maybe even unhealthy habits. I think that the status quo bias is certainly at work with regard to why I continuously fail to quit smoking. There may be framing effects. That's another kind of bias where we're choosing different options depending upon how those options are presented, right? So if it's framed this way, then we're more likely to choose that option. But if it's framed in some other way, then it's not very pleasing or desirable to us. There might be different kinds of hyperbolic discounting. This is a kind of cognitive bias where we value short-term pleasure, like a donut or a cigarette, over long-term health. Again, I think that's certainly playing a role in my own case. And I think it's plausible that these findings suggest that true autonomy may be compromised not by the government coming in and interfering with what we're able to do and what our choices are, how limited our choices are, but really, I think our autonomy might be compromised by our own psychology, right? By the environments that exploit our ability to make rational choices, such that maybe we don't even really have the autonomy that we take ourselves to have in the first place. So maybe a certain kind of paternalism then could help with this. Maybe paternalism actually could guide us in a direction where we're able to overcome some of the cognitive biases that seem to plague our decisions. So maybe paternalism and the government coming in to help us out and put in regulations and that sort of thing, maybe that could be beneficial because it actually enhances our autonomy rather than leaving ourselves to our own pitfalls, our own cognitive biases, which again may actually be a reduction of autonomy, not an increased autonomy. So let's say a little bit more here about acrasia and weakness of will. Placius connects philosophy and behavioral sciences in this regard. Take, for instance, Aristotle, who viewed acrasia as a kind of failure of practical reason. Right? Aristotle thought that knowing the good but failing to do it was just merely a kind of failure of reason. But today, different behavioral economists and different behavioral scientists are thinking about things quite differently. They're describing this very similar phenomenon that we see Aristotle commenting on and other philosophers commenting on. They're approaching this phenomenon using the language of self-control. For instance, we might sincerely plan to eat better tomorrow, but continually fail because our immediate desires override our long-term goals. So here, what we're thinking about is different competing desires, right? So I might have a desire to become to lose weight and to become more physically fit, and that requires going to the gym. So I may not really want to go to the gym. It may be something that I actually despise doing. I don't really want to be in public and working out and sweating and wake up early and that kind of stuff. I may not have the time to do it. I may have to rearrange my schedule, whatever. It may be a real pain in the ass. But nonetheless, my greater desire is to become physically fit or maybe to lose weight. If you play sports, if you're on the football team or the basketball team or volleyball team or anything like that, where it's a really crucial part of what you're doing to be physically fit, then that might be the deeper, more important desire that you have to win the game or win the championship or to make the team or something along those lines. So even though you don't really want to go to the gym, you don't want to wake up early in the morning to do that, nonetheless, your greater desire is to do well in football or volleyball or whatever it might be. Right. So that's a way of thinking about competing desires and how that makes sense of this notion of acrasia. So on this approach, then the human weakness arises as a kind of a moral question. If we can predictably act against our own best judgment, should society help us overcome those tendencies? It looks like it's a normative question, a question that directly relates to what Placius is saying here about moral philosophy and behavioral sciences. So, having explored all these issues as it relates to paternalism and liberalism, Placius then once again focuses on paternalism, right? Gives a sort of a revisiting of this issue. And, we can think about this in terms of our environments. If it's the case that our environment is already largely engineered by corporations trying to seek a profit, governments trying to regulate different aspects of our lives, well, then leaving people alone may not actually be neutral at all, right? We're not leaving people alone, we're actually turning them over to these corporations or whatever else is an external force, that is influencing their choices. Right. So things like food marketing, things like pricing. I mean, that's clearly a very important issue right now. Food is so expensive. Or the placement of where food is at in the shopping, the grocery store. All of these things certainly do have some role in shaping your behavior for the corporation's benefit, not necessarily for your own benefit. So, government regulations then may simply be a way to counterbalance these existing influences rather than creating new ones. So, now the question is not simply a matter of whether we are influenced. Clearly, we are. Instead, the question becomes by whom are we influenced and to what end is this influence occurring? So this brings up the notion of coercive paternalism, where what that means is paternalism that goes further than merely nudging people in the right direction. It's using these strict laws or prohibitions to enforce behavior, things like banning trans fats, or things like prohibiting supersized sugary drinks, or restricting marketing of junk food to children, or whatever else, where we're actually putting in place regulations and laws. And critics may think of this as being a dangerous kind of overreach. It's the government getting too involved in these choices. But proponents might actually think that it's justified when the public benefits and the social costs are large enough, especially when corporate manipulation seems to be undermining genuine choice. So this kind of coercive paternalism then forces us to weigh freedom against welfare and autonomy against justice. But still, we have to ask, whose values is it that really matters? Placius raises a key objection in this regard. When we're thinking about the good life, whose value is it that actually defines the good life? Not everyone agrees on what counts as healthy, and what might be healthy for one person may not be healthy for another person. For instance, if you're a football player, you probably have to eat many more calories than I do. I'm really quite skinny and kind of weak in a lot of regards. It doesn't take a lot of calories to keep me healthy, but it might take many more calories to keep you healthy. Or what is considered responsible eating? Maybe for some people, having a few drinks of alcohol, it might be perfectly fine and responsible. But for other people, having any alcohol at all could be morally problematic in a number of different ways. If, for instance, they are struggling with or experiencing some sort of an alcohol dependency issue. And we should also think about the cultural and religious traditions that are essential for understanding what we mean by health and responsibility as well as a good life. Right. So somebody that's a part of a very strict religious tradition might think of health and responsibility very differently from somebody who's approaching these issues from a secular position. All right. So culture and religion plays a huge role. We might also think about body politics or various socioeconomic conditions that all are going to play an important role in shaping how people view and value their food. Right, so paternalistic policies risk imposing one group's values on another group's situation in life and how they're viewing and thinking about the good life. It's imposing, maybe one political person's or one political group imposing those values on another political group and their approach to life. And it's often those of some form of privilege that end up imposing their views and their values on everyone else. And so this invites this notion of humility and pluralism. Indeed, we can pursue public health goals, but we must remain sensitive to the sort of diversity of values and lived experiences that people genuinely have. We need to try to avoid the kinds of stigmatization and moral panic and social policing of people's bodies that seem to be, sort of always a threatening aspect of what's going on here in this chapter. So Placius warns that food and health debates can very easily slide into moralism when we treat thinness as being the ideal body, or we treat things like clean eating as a moral virtue. When we do these sorts of things, we risk stigmatizing those who don't or can't conform. There's a really interesting book on fat phobia by a really great philosopher named Kate Mann. I highly recommend you look into this because it really does kind of address these issues of stigmatization and moral panic, and more specifically, the social policing of people's bodies and some of the issues that are involved there. So then, generally, public health campaigns can be good, right? Sometimes they produce good outcomes, but they can also encourage moral panic and frame things like obesity or certain diets as some sort of a social threat or something that should be excluded, or we should shame people for having larger bodies. Or introduce different kinds of social policies that favor one kind of body over another kind of a body, especially those of women, right? It's almost always women's bodies that people are concerned about in this regard, or maybe working class people, or certainly racial minorities, right? Like these are issues that we need to take serious as it relates to this threat of a kind of moral panic and shaming of people's bodies or social policing of people's bodies. So you might think then that a truly ethical food system will be one that avoids reinforcing the kinds of inequalities and shame that oftentimes is associated with promoting health itself, right? So whose responsibility? This leads to one of the most important questions. Who is it that's actually responsible for health in the first place? On the one hand, you might think that individuals are moral agents who make choices. And on the other hand, those choices occur in a context that's shaped by things like poverty and culture, advertisements, corporations, policies by the government. All these other things are influencing what people decide to do. So Plakius suggests that we need a shared responsibility model. Individuals, corporations, and governments all play some very key important role in shaping health outcomes. So reducing everything to some mere like personal responsibility or like you got to pull yourself up at your bootstraps and take care of yourself. This seems to obscure the important structural injustices that definitely do exist, and that influence people when they're making, or at least trying to make, healthy living choices, and experience a life that's meaningful for themselves. It makes those sorts of situations much harder than they should be, and harder for some than for others. Take, for instance, advertising. Advertising is one of the most powerful forces that shape food choices. Advertising doesn't simply inform people, it actually manipulates people. It exploits people with emotional triggers, different kinds of cognitive biases. And this happens especially for children that aren't really at a point where they can make a rational choice for themselves. Think about this from a deontological perspective, right? Kant argued that it's morally wrong to withhold information from people or to tell a lie to people, and that there's never any sort of exception in these cases. But think about what advertisements do. Advertisements explicitly try to manipulate you to get you to buy things you don't need, and to believe things that are not true, and it withholds information that you actually need in order to make a good, rational, autonomous, and informed decision about these things that you're putting into your body. Right? So this raises very serious questions about autonomy. Can we really say that people are free when billions are spent each and every year to engineer your desires, to engineer what sort of choices you're going to make? Plakius argues that a healthy food culture is going to depend upon trust. Trust between the producers, the regulators, the appetizers, and the consumers. And that trust is one that's not deliberately undermining our own autonomy for mere profit. And without that kind of trust, freedom of choice is simply just an illusion. Right, so these are some of the things that I think that are important to consider, and think about throughout this module.